1953 was a pretty good year in Detroit. Buick was celebrating its 50th anniversary, and GM was having a big celebration with all kinds of Motorama show cars like the Skylark, the Eldorado, and the Fiesta. So Packard figured they needed to get in on the action with the Caribbean. Today, these are some of the most highly sought Packards of the 50s, and I would argue that this is Packard's last great car. Largely hand-built, still powered by Packard's legendary straight-8 engine, and every bit a match for its luxurious competition from across the street. It's not significantly different than the standard Packards, but there are enough neat little details, the cutout wheel openings, the extra chrome trim, the Continental kit, all of which make the Packard Caribbean instantly recognizable, easy to identify, and on every collector's short wish list of great cars to own. Let's take a drive. Inside, the Caribbean offers pretty deluxe accommodations. It wasn't radically changed from the production line cars, very similar to a lot of the standard convertibles, the same gauges, same dashboard, but the Caribbean had every trick Packard could throw at it. It's got power steering, power brakes, power windows, which all work on this car. They're fully operational, and a fully operational power canvas top. So it makes it feel very modern when you're going down the road. All the comfort and convenience features that Packard could add are here. It has an AM radio, which does work. The only thing not working on this car, I believe, is the clock. It was given a frame-on restoration a couple years ago, so a lot of the things are new. It has this beautiful red leather interior, which I think is really a fantastic combination. But where this car really shines is out on the road. So let's take it out. Packards start a lot like Buicks. Turn the key, put the accelerator to the floor, and it fires right up. And this car in particular has always been extremely reliable. It's never given us a moments of trouble. Always fires right up, idles silently. Really a nice car. The 2-speed Packard Ultramatic transmission works just like any other automatic transmission. Just drop it into high range and go. Power steering on a really big, heavy car is probably mandatory at this point. Power-assisted brakes are a little touchy. They're drums. They are insanely overboosted. Takes almost no effort. This is American luxury car, make no mistake. Like its GM competition, the Eldorado, the Skylark, it is very much all about smoothness, comfort, and image. These were image cars, make no mistake. They only built a few hundred, I think just over 700 Caribbeans in 1953. So it wasn't about sales, it was to get people into Packard showrooms. And by 1953, Packard was on the ropes. Make no mistake about that. They were hurting. The acquisition of Studebaker was on the horizon, and there are a lot of people who say that was really the end of the end. This car, in my opinion, as a professional and as a collector, is probably the last great Packard. Largely hand-built with a lot of the body details done by guys in the factory, just smoothing lead onto the various components. That hood scoop is unique to this car, and that hood probably weighs 90 pounds. It is a pretty significant clean and jerk to get that thing up. It stays up with no problem. They've got some fairly robust hinges on there, but it's all lead. The scoop itself is cast from lead, and then they used as much as they needed to smear it in there and get it to look smooth. In the same way, the quarter panels were significantly reshaped, the wheel openings were changed, and the little fender, it's not quite a fin, but the little winglet on the back gives a little bit of a hint of what was to come in the later 50s. This is just a wonderful car to drive, effortless. The engine is Packard's familiar flathead straight 8. This one is 327 cubic inches. By 1953, they put a 4-barrel carburetor on it, and it makes a fairly impressive 180 horsepower. And it moves this rather heavy car without a lot of effort. The Ultramatic is just a 2-speed, so it spends most of its time in high range, but the low range is low enough that it steps off nicely, and it's got reasonably comfortable gears underneath. So it's a highway cruiser. I've run this car down the road at 70 miles an hour without any effort. It idles beautifully at a stoplight. You can almost not feel it running. I can feel just the slightest vibration through the steering wheel, but the same legendary Packard straight 8 smoothness is still present in spades here. And it hangs on to first gear a little bit longer than you think it should, simply because it's a 2-speed. And then it makes a nice clean shift to second, and you're good to go. Unfortunately, it seems like we have more traffic than usual today. I'll try to find some quieter roads, but I guess it also demonstrates how easy to use this Packard really is. We're still in high range. There's plenty of creamy, smooth torque on tap, and it keeps up with traffic easily. So you want a car that really doesn't ask you for many compromises, this is probably a good choice. As I mentioned, this car enjoyed a rather extensive frame-on restoration in 2012, I believe, and that included paint, chrome, interior, top, engine and transmission rebuild, but I don't believe the body has ever been off the frame. And given the condition of the undercarriage, the quality of the floors, this car lives somewhere warm, so taking it apart down to the molecular level just wasn't necessary. And that always leaves you with a car that ends up being really user-friendly, tighter feeling. This car, even for an ancient, heavy, handmade convertible, has virtually no squeaks and rattles, and nothing's buzzing, jiggling. It's really kind of impressive because you don't see that too often in cars of this vintage. I'm going to lean on it a little bit, and you know, it urges itself ahead pretty well. It's about 60 or 65, and it feels like it would run at this speed all day. The ride is smooth. This car's sitting on chrome wire wheels, which were standard on the Caribbean, as well as a set of late model white wall radials. And if you've watched our videos and read our write-ups, you know we're fans of radials on antique cars like this. If you can use them, they really make a difference in ride quality and particularly the way the car goes down the road. This Packard's no exception. Brakes are plenty powerful, and like I said, over boosted. I mean, I just barely have to lean on them and it stops it easily. Even over rough pavement, that suspension just feels supple and well controlled, not loose and sloppy. This particular color looks a lot like Packard cream, and this was a late addition. It's called a springtime color. It was a late addition to the roster in 1953, introduced in April. And there's no real accurate count, but most experts seem to believe that fewer than 10 were built in Packard cream like this with the red interior. And I think it's just a striking combination. It's really, compared to all the red, burgundy, green ones that you see, this is really an attractive car that looks light and sporty, and the cutouts on the rear wheel certainly help. The lack of fender skirts, all of that sort of disguises just how big this car really is. I like this car so much, and I believe in it. It's just been so reliable. We took it to Hershey last October, and we drove it around. This was our car that we drove to our hotel. We went out to dinner, whatever, because we knew it would always start. It'll go highway speeds. It'll sit in traffic without overheating. And even if it's cold in the morning, this sucker fires right up and idles nice. The convertible top and the power windows all work correctly, so it seals up very well. And even the heater puts out some decent heat. You know, it's about 70 degrees today. I don't need it, but you know, on a 35-degree morning in Hershey, it was nice to have it putting out a few BTUs to toast us up a little bit. It has drum brakes all around, of course. Discs were still a decade away for just about any manufacturer, but they're very big drums. So all that worry about, oh, I have to convert to disc brakes before I can use it, that's not true. It's plenty powerful. And you can see that it tracks real well. The alignment is good. And with the radials, it really goes down the road like it should. Gauges are kind of minimalist. Speedometer, fuel gauge, and a temperature gauge, which is nice, but oil pressure and generator are both indicated by idiot lights. They do work, and I guess that keeps a reasonable eye on things mechanically, but this is a Packard after all. They weren't too worried about things breaking. And you can still feel the quality in the car, even though Packard was sort of unwinding and they had a very limited budget. The quality is tangible. You slam the door, it makes a very solid sound that I've never heard in the GM cars. The suspension has a suppleness to it. It's not eliminating the bumps, but it gives you the feeling that it's got them under control. And I think there's a kind of quiet confidence to the car that was always a Packard hallmark. It's baked into this Caribbean as well. And that, I think, is a testament to their dedication to doing the job right. Money was getting tight, but they weren't quite willing at this point to compromise on quality. That day would surely come, but in 1953, they figured if we can just keep the lights on for a few more years, get our new V8 engine out there, and maybe convince people that Packards are the right alternative to a Cadillac, then they might have a fighting chance. Packard actually bought Studebaker, not the other way around, with the intention of putting to work their economies of scale and perhaps introducing some lower cost models. Studebaker already had a range of V8 engines in the pipeline, so it was going to be an access point to a lot of improved production techniques and new hardware that they may not have been able to develop on their own. Now, ultimately, it didn't work out that way, and management decided to kill Packard before Studebaker, so the company they bought ended up being the company that survived. But in 1953, this was 100% Packard. These were Packard engineers. These are the guys who were building the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines in World War II just a few years earlier, because Rolls-Royce found that Packard was the only company in America that could build things to a fine enough tolerance for their standards. And I think that tells you all you need to know about why Packards are special. And on a road like this, where we're just loafing along at 40, 45 miles an hour, this is just lovely. The engine is silent. Ride quality is excellent. Wind control with the wraparound windshield. It's really very pleasant here. I could drive this all day, which maybe I will. We haven't had many dry days yet this spring, so I take my opportunities to drive when I can get them. And I wanted to showcase a car from the 50s, but one that probably had a good story to tell, and the Caribbean is that car. For a while we had a Packard, 1953 Packard convertible that wasn't a Caribbean, a Cavalier. And you can see the family resemblance. The front fenders were the same, the doors were the same, the dashboard was the same. But in back, the stylists opened up the wheel arches. The other car had kind of a half-skirted look that made it kind of look frumpy. But opening up the wheel arch makes the Caribbean look downright sporty. The Continental kit on the back was still kind of a high-end luxury car look. And there is a spare tire in there. So it's a little bit of a wrestling match to get it out of there. It tilts out of the way for trunk access. But I think if this were my car, I'd put another spare into its slot in the trunk and leave the Continental kit alone. But it certainly gives the Caribbean its distinctive look from behind. Both cars use the same taillights, although they were rotated 90 degrees on the Caribbean. So it has a completely unique look without the need for new tooling. And there's a lot of little clever things like that throughout this car that made the Caribbean special. With all the chrome on this car, it's probably a $25,000 bill to restore the chrome on a 50s car like this. Most of it remains in excellent condition. The grille, the bumpers, all of the exterior trim's been restored. I believe the horn ring is probably original. The dash and gauges appear to be original. So they're showing a little bit of age, but nothing that I would worry about. You could certainly take it apart and try to pursue perfection, but that's no fun. Guys who do perfect cars end up not driving them. And what this car really does best is drive. Just another almost seamless shift from the Ultramatic. If you're just soft pedaling it, it's very unobtrusive. And although there was a larger 356-inch version of the straight 8, Packard didn't use it in this car in 1953. I'm not quite sure why, but I certainly can't complain about the way this 327 runs. It's a mistake to think of it as a little motor. And as with all Packard straight 8s, boy, it really delivers in the torque department. Very smooth and creamy, but hills like we're going up and down now, completely effortless. Ignore them, it charges up the hills, it has no problem keeping up. In 1954, they did add the larger engine to the roster, and production actually went down. And while the 54 car is visually similar, they did cut back on the number of cosmetic changes because of all the handwork required. So the quarter panels went back to being production quarter panels and the semi-skirted wheels, and it kind of lost that lighter, sportier look that only the 53s seem to have. So while the 54s might offer a little more punch, you're not going to notice it, and the 53s are just much prettier cars. That's personal opinion, no offense to the guys who love the 54s, but if I were going to have a Packard from the 50s, this is the only one I would consider. Packard's last year of production, of course, was 1958, and those really weren't even Packards anymore. A lot of people jokingly call them the Packard bakers. They were not particularly attractive. They were struggling to make them distinct from the Studebakers. But again, they didn't have a lot of money to work with. And I think it's kind of a sad end to one of the great automakers. They managed to survive the 30s without any help from a parent company, which I find rather extraordinary. Almost every one of the big independents passed away during the Great Depression. Packard survived largely because of their reputation for quality, the performance of the cars, and a very loyal clientele. And I have to imagine that there were guys who would have bought a 12-cylinder Packard in the late 30s who would have gone into showrooms after the war and picked up a Caribbean, recognizing that this was the same kind of bespoke luxury car that they'd become accustomed to during the Great Depression. It's a little flashier, which I think by the 50s was probably much more popular with buyers than in the 30s. And it feels like a Packard. It deserves to wear the Packard name. I like little details like the shifter echoes the shape of the pre-war shifters once they move them to the column. Packard always put this little twist on the end, so it's just right there at your fingertips. I like the big ivory colored steering wheel, the horn ring. It's got a lot of recalls to their history. The crest is the same one that Packard had been using almost since the beginning. And if you're worried about user friendliness and the ability to drive a car in modern traffic, as you can see, this car is really not a liability in the least. Despite being, God, is it coming up on its 70th birthday now? That's fairly extraordinary. And it shows you just how far they'd come after the war. Or maybe just how far we haven't come today. Because this car is not a lot different. The big steering wheel is kind of cool and you feel like you're at the helm of something substantial. With power steering, you certainly didn't need it, but I really dig that. Just squeezing the throttle, there's a nice push of torque. It's not muscle car torque, it's not gonna snap your head back by any means, but it feels inevitable that this car will climb any hill and merge with any traffic, and it's that quiet confidence that I mentioned earlier. It just feels like whatever the situation, this car's ready to handle it. I hope you enjoyed your ride in the 53 Caribbean. I'm going to pull it in and park it. We'll see you next time. Thanks for riding along with us.